What would you do if you found a freezing kitten at work? Huddled behind the pallets was a shivering, grapefruit-sized puff of fur, small enough to fit in 2 hands, but powerful enough to melt the heart of a hardened logistics crew in under 30 seconds. They named him Peanut. Then Peanut started to change. First came the attitude. Then came the black ear tufts, sharp as little exclamation points. And when his coat began to show those wild, flicked paint spots, the truth hit harder than that sub-zero loading dock wind. Peanut wasn't a stray house cat. He was a bobcat. And suddenly the warehouse had a brand new problem. Because how do you set boundaries with a coworker who could, in theory, eat your face? Stick around, because this is the story of how a wild bobcat became the most respected boss on the floor. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. It was late November in northern Minnesota, the kind of cold that didn't just sit on the skin but burrowed into the bones, making metal squeak and turning every breath into a drifting little ghost. The warehouse sat on the ragged edge of an industrial park just outside Duluth, a hulking rectangle of corrugated steel and fluorescent light that hummed against the silence of the snow-covered world. Inside, it was a labyrinth of endless aisles, shrink-wrapped pallets, and cardboard towers. Outside, the drifts were piled like frozen waves, waiting to crash. Rick Alvarez, a forklift operator who had worked the docks long enough to know the groan of the building better than his own car, was the first to spot the anomaly. He was maneuvering a pallet of crates near the cinder block wall when he caught a flicker of movement where absolutely no movement should have been. He killed the engine, the silence rushing back in, and squinted into the shadows behind a stack of empty pallets. At first, he assumed it was a rat. Warehouses always had that one rat, the bold one that acted like it paid rent and resented the noise. "Oh, come on," Rick muttered, rubbing a gloved hand over his face. The last thing anybody needed on a Tuesday before lunch was feelings. The warehouse already had enough problems. Busted pallets, shipments that were perpetually late, and the mysterious ongoing disappearance of the break room donuts. Now, the universe had decided to add a stray animal in sub-zero weather to the list. He crouched, careful and slow, because he wasn't stupid and he liked having all 10 fingers. "Hey buddy, you lost?" The rat lifted its head. It wasn't a rat. Rick saw a tiny, triangular face with round, terrified eyes and a smudged nose. It was a kitten, no bigger than a grapefruit, trembling so violently its whole body blurred like a shivered leaf. It didn't run. It was simply too tired to argue with gravity. Rick took off one heavy work glove, reached out slowly, and the kitten didn't hiss. Instead, it pressed its face blindly into his palm, seeking the only warmth in the entire world. That was the first punch to the heart. The second punch was noticing the blood. It wasn't much, just a thin, jagged smear along one ear and a raw scrape on its side, like it had dragged itself through something sharp to get inside. Its fur was damp and stiff, spiked with ice crystals. Rick did what forklift operators have done since the beginning of time when faced with a crisis they couldn't lift. He swore softly under his breath and called for backup. Within minutes, half the warehouse crew had formed a circle around the cardboard box Rick had procured, looking like a tiny, unauthorized staff meeting. There was Tina Beck, the shift supervisor, a woman who ran logistics like a 4-star general and dispensed snacks like a grandmother. There was Marcus Moose O'Donnell, 6'4" of gentle giant who was once caught apologizing to a vending machine after shaking it. And there was Cheryl, the inventory clerk, who could count 50 boxes at a glance but currently couldn't take her eyes off the shivering bundle. "That's somebody's kitten," Tina declared, folding her arms. She said it with the kind of authority that usually made things true, but her eyes were worried. "It's gonna freeze out here," Rick said, stating the practical thing, which was usually his job. Marcus leaned down, his massive shadow falling over the box. The kitten bumped its forehead against his finger, a tiny motion of desperate trust. Cheryl made a sound, that specific high-pitched noise people make when they are already mentally rearranging their furniture to accommodate a pet. "Okay," Tina sighed, the sound of a woman accepting a responsibility she hadn't signed paperwork for. "We do this right. Nobody gets bit, nobody gets sued, nobody names it something stupid." "Look at that little face," Moose whispered, his voice full of uncharacteristic reverence. "That's a peanut." Cheryl glared at him. Tina glared at him harder. Rick, traitor that he was, looked at the small brown shape and shrugged. "Peanut's not bad." So the kitten became Peanut, at least for the length of one very long afternoon. They moved the box into the break room, lining it with shop towels and an old hoodie that smelled like coffee. Someone, no one ever admitted who, though everyone suspected Moose, plugged in a space heater and pointed it toward the box like a holy offering. The kitten crawled into the heat, made a sound that was too raspy to be a purr, and fell asleep instantly. The warehouse should have gone back to normal. The forklifts should have beeped, the conveyor belts should have hummed, and Tina should have been able to pretend this wasn't happening. But the atmosphere had shifted. Everyone kept checking inventory in the break room, which was fascinating, considering the break room contained zero inventory. Tina, being Tina, started making calls. She called the local animal shelter and was told, politely, that they were full. She called a wildlife hotline and got a voicemail that sounded like it was recorded during a windstorm. Finally, she called her husband to ask if he'd ever heard of a stray kitten breaking into a secure facility. "It's America, babe," he said. "Anything's possible." Eventually, she reached a licensed wildlife rehabilitator named Diane Keller, who operated out of a small clinic south of town. Diane listened to Tina's description of the kitten, her silence growing heavier on the line. "Does it have spots?" Diane asked abruptly. Tina looked down at the sleeping animal. In the warm fluorescent light of the break room, the coat wasn't the muddy brown of a barn cat. It was speckled, patterned with dark rosettes like someone had flicked paint across a canvas. Tina swallowed. "Yeah," she said carefully. "It's got spots." "Does it have little tufts on the ears?" Tina leaned closer. The ears were small, rounded, but yes, there were tiny black tufts rising from the tips, like ink strokes. Tina suddenly felt like she was standing on thin ice made entirely of liability. "Oh," Tina said. "Oh no." "That's not a domestic kitten," Diane said, her voice calm with the weight of experience. "That's a bobcat kitten." The room went silent, except for the vending machine humming in the corner like it had known all along. Tina covered the phone and looked at her crew. Rick's eyebrows had climbed into his hairline. Cheryl covered her mouth. Moose, blinking slowly, whispered, "So Peanut is spicy." "Moose!" Tina hissed. Diane continued, her instructions clear. "It needs help, but it also needs boundaries. No cuddling, no petting, no selfies. If it's truly a bobcat kitten, it's protected wildlife. Keeping it is illegal and unsafe, and bobcats don't stay small no matter how much you love them." Cheryl looked personally offended by that last statement, as if love should be able to negotiate with biology. Diane arrived that evening in a truck loaded with carriers and heavy leather gloves. She examined the kitten with practiced, gentle hands, confirming what Tina already knew in her bones. It was a bobcat, maybe 8 or 9 weeks old, severely underweight and cold-stressed. It had likely been separated from its mother during the storm, perhaps a car accident, perhaps chased by dogs. "You did the right thing," Diane told the group of warehouse workers, who were hovering like worried relatives in a hospital waiting room. "You kept it warm. You called for help." She paused, giving them a pointed look. "And it's lucky you didn't try to raise it yourselves." "Hypothetically," Moose said, raising a hand, "if someone did raise a bobcat, would it, learn to drive a forklift?" Tina made a noise that suggested she might throw her clipboard at him. Diane smiled, a rare, dry expression. "Hypothetically, it would learn to open your cabinets, steal your chicken, and shred your curtains. Then it would hit adolescence and remind you that it is, in fact, a wild animal with 5 ends that are sharp." Cheryl looked down at the kitten one last time. It was still small enough to fit in 2 hands, fragile and sleepy. It opened its eyes, gold and ancient, and looked at her. It made a soft, raspy mew. Not a domestic sound. It was something wilder, a piece of the forest speaking through a tiny throat. Diane loaded the carrier. As she walked toward the door, the kitten reached one paw through the bars, just for a second, curling its claws as if trying to hold on to the warmth it had found. Cheryl turned away fast, pretending to check a text message. Rick cleared his throat and stared at the floor. Tina watched with her jaw set tight, because bosses weren't supposed to cry at work. That should have been the end of the story. A sad beginning, a responsible decision, and a return to the status quo. The warehouse went back to its normal problems. But life has a way of circling back. And bobcats, it turns out, have a way of choosing their own addresses. 3 months later, in late February, the warehouse began to lose a war. It wasn't a war against logistics or supply chains. It was a war against rodents. The bitter, unrelenting cold had driven mice and rats into the building as if it were a hotel with a vacancy sign. They found tiny holes, slipped under dock doors, and treated the inventory like an all-you-can-eat buffet. They chewed packaging, left droppings in the aisles, and made everyone jumpy. Even Tina, who had the soul of a drill sergeant, started flinching at shadows. Pest control came and went. Traps were set, holes were patched. But the warehouse was a complicated ecosystem of warmth and hiding spots, and the rodents were winning. "We're getting outsmarted," Rick declared one morning, holding up a bag of bird seed that had been chewed open, "by something that weighs less than a sandwich." Then, on a Thursday morning, Marcus Moose O'Donnell walked in early to start the coffee and froze in the main aisle. Sitting on a pallet of shrink wrap, centered perfectly as if assigned there by management, was a bobcat. It wasn't a kitten anymore, not even close. It was a young sub-adult, lean and long-legged, with a coat patterned like sunlight filtering through autumn leaves. Its ears wore those black tufts like punctuation marks. Its eyes were the color of old honey, and they looked straight at Moose with calm, terrifying curiosity. Moose whispered, "Peanut?" as if the name might summon the past. The bobcat blinked slowly. Then it did the most confusing thing a wild predator can do in an industrial setting. It yawned. A giant, lazy yawn that displayed a formidable set of teeth before stretching across the pallet like it was clocking in for a shift. When Tina arrived, Moose was still standing there, hands raised, his brain caught between awe and the urge to run. Tina followed his gaze and stopped dead. "You have got to be kidding me." Rick came around the corner a moment later. "We're haunted. he whispered. Cheryl rushed in, saw the animal, and let out a sound like her heart had been handed back to her. "That's him," she breathed. "That's our baby." "Not our baby," Tina corrected, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "Not anyone's baby. That is a wild bobcat who has apparently decided we are part of his commute." The bobcat hopped down from the pallet, its paws silent on the concrete. It moved with a fluid confidence, unbothered by the lights or the distant hum of the heater. It passed a stack of boxes, paused, ears swiveling toward a dark corner where the mice liked to congregate. Then, with a blur of motion too fast to track, it pounced. There was a squeak, brief and final. The bobcat lifted its head, a mouse in its jaws, and looked around the room as if waiting for a performance review. Then it trotted toward the loading bay, slipped through a small gap in the rubber seal of the dock door, and vanished into the snow. "He just took care of it," Moose whispered, reverent as a man in church. "Well," Tina exhaled, "that's one way to handle pest control." They called Diane again. Tina was not about to let a bobcat set up a franchise without professional advice. Diane listened, and for the first time, she sounded unsurprised. "That sounds like a rehabbed juvenile," Diane explained. "Sometimes, when they're released, they return to areas they associate with safety or food, especially in harsh weather. If it's the same bobcat, he remembers the smell of the place. But listen to me. You cannot treat him like a pet. No names, no food, no benefits package." "Understood," Tina said. "If you feed him, he loses his fear of humans, and that will get him killed. If he's hunting rodents, that's natural behavior. But if anyone tries to touch him, tell them I will personally haunt them." So, the warehouse established the Bobcat protocols. Rule 1. The Bobcat was not allowed in the break room, no matter how cold he looked. Rule 2. Absolute prohibition on feeding. Rule 3. Everyone was to admire from a respectful distance, like tourists at a national park. Rule 4. Moose was absolutely not allowed to suggest giving him a safety vest. That last rule held for exactly 1 week. A package arrived from an online retailer labeled Novelty Pet Costume. Cheryl held up the miniature high-visibility orange vest, laughing and crying at the same time. Tina confiscated it immediately, locking it in her office drawer like contraband. "Just picture it," Moose pleaded. "Tiny OSHA compliance." "Moose," Tina said, rubbing her temples. "The Bobcat is already OSHA compliant because he doesn't walk under suspended loads and he doesn't text while driving. Also, he would fire us." "Also," Rick added, "he would eat your face." The Bobcat returned the next day, and the next. He never stayed when the warehouse was loudest. He appeared at dawn or dusk, patrolling the perimeter, checking the pallets. He became a ghost in the aisles, a rumor with tufted ears, and the rodents began to disappear. It wasn't magic. It was the presence of an apex predator disrupting the comfortable ecosystem the mice had built. The employees started calling him the Inspector. He appeared when things were off. A chewed box, a weird noise. Rick claimed the Bobcat could sense rodent activity through the concrete. Cheryl claimed he sensed human sadness, appearing on days when morale was low. Moose insisted with total sincerity that the Bobcat respected Tina as a fellow alpha predator. Truck drivers would arrive and ask, "Is the inspector here today?" as if he were the floor manager. A corporate auditor once came through, saw claw marks on a wooden beam high up in the rafters, and asked in a trembling voice, Do we have a cat? Tina stared him dead in the eyes. We have a highly motivated independent contractor. It was funny until it wasn't. One evening in early spring, a storm rolled in. Wet, heavy snow that turned to ice instantly. The wind howled around the loading docks, making the metal groan. Rick was locking up the back bay when he heard it. A sound he hadn't heard since that first day behind the crates. A small, strained cry. He grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound to the dumpsters near the tree line. There, crouched in the lee of the wind, was the Bobcat. He was soaked, his fur matted with ice. But worse, he was holding one hind leg up, refusing to put weight on it. He looked at Rick, his golden eyes wide with pain and fear. He didn't run. He couldn't. Rick's stomach dropped. He backed away slowly, hands up, and dialed Tina. "It's the inspector," he said, his voice tight. "He's hurt." Tina was there in 10 minutes, wearing a coat over her pajamas. Cheryl and Moose arrived moments later. They stood in the snow, watching the animal shiver. "We wait," Tina said, though she looked like she wanted to run forward and scoop him up. "We do it right." She called Diane. The next hour felt like a year. Diane arrived with a conservation officer and a humane trap. They baited it, set it, and waited in the warmth of the truck. It was agonizing. The Bobcat, exhausted and driven by pain, eventually limped toward the scent of food. When the trapdoor snapped shut, he didn't even thrash. He just laid down, defeated. Cheryl cried into her mittens. Rick looked at the ground, feeling guilty for reasons he couldn't name. Moose whispered, "Hang on, Inspector." At the clinic, X-rays confirmed a fracture, likely a slip on the ice or a bad landing while hunting. It was fixable, but it meant surgery and weeks of rehabilitation. Strict isolation, no visits, no warehouse. "He needs to stay wild," Diane reminded them the next day. "If he gets too comfortable with people now while he's vulnerable, he can never go back." The warehouse felt empty for the next month. The aisles seemed wider, the shadows less interesting. Even the mice, sensing the vacancy, began to test the boundaries again. Moose found a fresh dropping on a pallet and sighed. "The inspector is on medical leave and you guys are acting up." The crew channeled their energy into the only thing they could control: the environment. They sealed the gaps in the loading bay properly this time. They cleaned the perimeter. Cheryl organized a quiet collection for Diane's clinic, a jar labeled Inspector's Healthcare sitting on the break room table. Tina pretended not to see it, then slipped a $50 bill inside when she thought no one was looking. Spring finally broke the back of winter. The snow melted into mud, and the air turned sweet with thaw. Diane called Tina. "He's healed. He's hunting. We're releasing him tomorrow." "Where?" Tina asked. "A wooded area about 10 miles north. Better cover, less traffic." Diane paused. Since you're the reason he's alive, twice now, the officer says you can watch. From a distance." They stood in the woods the next morning. Tina, Rick, Cheryl, and Moose, lined up behind a barrier of caution tape Diane had strung between two pines. The woods smelled of damp earth and pine needles. Diane opened the carrier door. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a head emerged. The ears swiveled, catching the sound of wind in the branches. The Bobcat stepped out, testing the ground. He looked bigger than they remembered. The cast gone, his movement fluid and powerful. He paused. He turned his head, and his gaze swept over the line of humans. He looked at Moose, then Cheryl, then Tina. There was no movie moment of understanding, no nod of gratitude. Just a wild animal acknowledging the landscape, assessing the threats, and deciding these strange, tall creatures were not worth his time. He turned and melted into the underbrush, vanishing as if he had never been there at all. "Go own the forest," Moose whispered. Cheryl wiped her eyes. He didn't even say goodbye. He said, "I'm out of here," Rick said, grinning, which is the best thing he could say. Back at the warehouse, life returned to its rhythm. Shipments in, shipments out. But the crew was different, a little softer, a little more observant. And then, because the universe loves a sequel, the Bobcat returned. It was June. Rick was parking his car when he saw the silhouette against the fence line. He froze. The Bobcat was sitting there, calm as a statue, watching the building. He didn't come to the door. He didn't try to get in. He just sat there, acknowledging the territory. Rick rushed inside. "He's back." They all went to the window. The Bobcat yawned, stretched, and then began to groom his paw, completely unbothered by the industrial noise. "The inspector is doing a perimeter check," Moose said, beaming. "Fine," Tina murmured, hiding a smile. "But he is still not getting a vest." From that day on, the Bobcat became a fixture. Not a pet, but a neighbor. He would disappear for weeks, then show up on a random Tuesday, perched on a stack of pallets outside or walking along the roofline. The warehouse adapted. They put up a sign near the loading bay. "Wildlife on site. Observe from distance." Underneath, someone had Sharpied, "Yes, even if he looks like he's smiling." The true test came in October, when a new hire named Evan started. Evan was 19, eager, and lived his life for social media. On his third day, he spotted the Bobcat near the dumpsters and instinctively pulled out his phone, stepping closer to get the perfect shot. "Evan!" Tina's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "Back up, now." Evan froze. "But it is a wild predator," Tina said, marching across the lot with Cheryl and Moose flanking her like bodyguards. "Back away." The Bobcat watched them, ears flicking forward. He didn't panic. He simply stood up, gave Evan a look of profound boredom, and slipped through a hole in the fence. Evan looked at Tina, stunned. "I didn't mean any harm." Tina's expression softened. She remembered being young and thinking the world was something to be captured rather than respected. "He comes here because we respect him," she said. "Respect means distance. Respect means letting him be wild. If you try to make him a pet, you kill him." Moose clapped a heavy hand on the kid's shoulder. "Also, if you get too close, he will steal your soul and your sandwich." That night, Tina sat on her porch with a mug of tea, thinking about the strange journey of the last year. A warehouse was not a forest. A Bobcat was not a mascot. But the lines had blurred in a way that made everyone better. They had learned that you didn't need to own something to love it. In fact, the best kind of love, the kind that kept a wild thing safe, was the kind that let it go. The Bobcat still comes around. Sometimes on snowy nights, Rick will see fresh tracks near the loading bay door, a loop of paw prints investigating the perimeter before heading back to the woods. He smiles, finishes his shift, and leaves the lights on for a few extra minutes, just so the inspector can see his way home.